June 1943. The war in Europe had reached a turning point, though few yet understood it. On the battlefields of North Africa, German forces had been defeated, surrounded, and forced into surrender in numbers that defied precedent. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms in Tunisia, ending the Desert War, not with a dramatic last stand but with paperwork, ration lines, and the quiet realization that the campaign was over. For the men who surrendered, the war did not end. It simply changed direction. They expected humiliation. They expected hunger, beatings, and cages. What they did not expect was America. The first encounter came not with guards or weapons, but with light. When the trains carrying German prisoners rolled into small towns across the southern United States, the nights were not dark. Farmhouses glowed. Streets were illuminated. Storefronts burned bright well past sunset. For men raised under wartime blackout orders, trained to fear every uncovered bulb as an invitation to bombers, the sight was unsettling. This was not a capital city. These were rural towns, places that propaganda had described as backward and decadent. Yet electricity flowed freely without fear, without rationing, without apology. The prisoners were men who had lived under scarcity for years. In Germany, even before the war, much of the countryside lacked electrification. During the conflict, energy was tightly controlled, redirected toward factories and the military, while civilians lived with restrictions that hardened into normality. Darkness had become routine. The glow they now saw through train windows did not fit the world they thought they understood. That contradiction followed them everywhere. From the moment of capture, American efficiency began dismantling assumptions the prisoners carried with them. At temporary holding camps in North Africa, processing moved at a pace they had never experienced. Identity papers were issued quickly. Medical examinations were thorough and systematic. Rights under international law were explained in fluent German by officers who seemed not only prepared, but practiced. There was no shouting, no confusion, no theatrical cruelty. It was administration, scaled to a level that suggested planning far beyond the immediate battlefield. Then came the food. For soldiers who had endured months of dwindling rations in the desert, American meals felt unreal. White bread appeared regularly. Coffee was served without substitutes. Meat was not an occasional reward, but a standard component. At first, many prisoners assumed it was a trick, a performance designed to soften them for interrogation or propaganda. They told themselves it would not last, that it could not last. But it did. When transport ships arrived to carry the prisoners across the Atlantic, the vessels themselves became symbols of a deeper imbalance. These were not repurposed liners or aging freighters, they were newly built cargo ships, assembled with astonishing speed. The men were told almost casually how long construction had taken. Days, not months. A timeline that would have sounded absurd if it had not been confirmed by the physical reality beneath their feet. The ships were returning from Europe, having delivered weapons, vehicles, and supplies to Allied armies. Rather than waste the return journey, they carried prisoners instead, tens of thousands per month. The scale alone hinted at something unsettling. This was not a desperate nation scraping together transport. This was a system operating at surplus. During the crossing, the prisoners watched food thrown away, not hidden, not rationed carefully, discarded openly. Half-eaten meals, milk that had spoiled by American standards, bread left untouched. The guards did not mock them with it. They did not comment. Waste, it seemed, carried no meaning here. The implication was more powerful than any insult. Scarcity was not part of the calculation. For men raised on the idea that Germany was fighting for survival against an inferior but numerically overwhelming enemy, the conclusion was hard to avoid. This enemy was not straining. It was not improvising. It was operating from abundance. As the ships approached the American coast, the sense of unease deepened. Cargo vessels bristled with equipment the prisoners had believed rare or experimental. Radar antennas rotated steadily above bridges. Communication systems operated continuously. This was not elite technology reserved for battleships or command centers. It was standard equipment mounted on ships designed to haul cargo and prisoners. The war some realized might already be lost. When the prisoners disembarked, they did not step into secrecy. They entered visibility ports, stretched for miles, crowded with cranes, warehouses, rail yards, and ships moving in coordinated rhythm. Cargo was loaded and unloaded simultaneously on multiple docks. Trains waited in sequence, engines ready, schedules synchronized. In a single day, a major American port handled volumes that rivaled what the largest European ports managed in a week. The prisoners were marched through parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, not official vehicles, not military transports. Personal cars belonging to workers. In Germany, car ownership remained rare, restricted largely to elites and party officials. The promised people's car had remained mostly a promise. Here, dock workers drove themselves to work, then came the trains. They expected freight wagons, boxcars, the crude transport they had known across Europe. Instead, they boarded passenger coaches, padded seats, sleeping berths, dining cars. Some even had observation windows. Guards appeared almost apologetic when mechanical issues interrupted climate control. The concept itself required explanation, cooling the air inside a train in summer for prisoners. As the trains rolled inland, the illusion of propaganda collapsed mile by mile. Small towns passed in a blur of lighted windows. Factories ran through the night. Parking lots remained full after midnight. Infrastructure that in Germany would have been reserved for major cities appeared everywhere, woven into daily life. The prisoners watched rail crews refuel and service trains with speed and automation that felt surgical. Coal loaders operated mechanically. Water pumps ran electrically. Maintenance tasks that would have required hours and teams of laborers in Europe were completed in minutes. The workers themselves wore sturdy boots, drank bottled beverages, smoked freely, and discarded what they did not want. They did not behave like people under siege. For some prisoners, the realization came quietly. For others, it struck like a physical blow. They had been told America was inefficient, divided, distracted by luxury. What they saw instead was a society that had turned luxury into infrastructure and infrastructure into power. As the trains crossed deeper into the continent, industrial scale expanded beyond anything they had imagined. Factories stretched along rivers for miles. Power plants consumed electricity in quantities that dwarfed entire European cities. New industrial complexes stood where fields had existed only months earlier. The speed of construction alone challenged everything German engineers believed possible. Agriculture delivered the next shock. Grain elevators towered over rail lines, holding harvests measured not in villages or regions, but in nations. Barges carried food in quantities that suggested not careful allocation but overflow. Meatpacking centers processed livestock at scales that rendered individual animals abstract. Workers ate during breaks, what soldiers in Germany had not seen for years. The prisoners began to understand that this war was not being fought on equal terms. When they finally arrived at camps in the American interior, the pattern continued. Barracks were lit, heated, and sanitary. Hospitals were equipped beyond what many civilian facilities in Germany possessed. Medicine was administered freely, including treatments that German doctors had only heard rumors of. Mental health care existed. Suicide attempts were met with counseling, not punishment. For men indoctrinated to believe that mercy was weakness, this created a new and troubling question. If America could afford to treat enemies this way, what else could it afford? The answer would unfold over the months ahead, not through lectures or slogans, but through work, observation, and daily life. The prisoners would see factories running without pause, farms producing beyond necessity, cities operating without fear. They would see women, minorities, and teenagers operating complex machinery. They would read newspapers that criticized their own government openly. They would watch films that exposed national flaws without apology. And slowly, inevitably, the war they thought they were fighting would cease to exist. What remained was something far more dangerous to the ideology they had carried with them: proof. Proof that abundance could coexist with freedom. Proof that efficiency did not require tyranny. proof that a society built on participation rather than domination could outproduce an empire built on fear. By the time the prisoners understood this fully, it was already too late. The battlefield had shifted. The conflict was no longer about territory or weapons. It was about reality itself, and reality was winning. The Americans did not need to argue with their prisoners. They simply let the prisoners look around. In the first weeks, the camps felt like a strange pause in the war, a holding pattern before something harsher began. The guard towers were real, but the rhythm inside the wire was not what most Germans expected. There were roll calls, work details, regulations. Yet there was also routine comfort. Lights that stayed on, showers that ran hot, toilets that flushed, kitchens that did not collapse into chaos. The prisoners had imagined captivity as a descent. Instead, for many, it felt like stepping sideways into a parallel world where shortages did not rule every decision. The most loyal Nazis in the compounds tried to explain it away. They called it theater, a temporary trick meant to break discipline. They told the younger men that America was putting on a show for German eyes, that behind the curtain the country was soft, fragile, decadent, and close to collapse. But every day the curtain refused to fall. The first cracks appeared in small conversations and private notebooks. Men who had repeated propaganda slogans for years began asking questions they would never have voiced at home. How could a democracy build this much, this fast? How could a nation supposedly controlled by internal enemies run systems that work so smoothly? How could a people described as lazy throw away food as if it were nothing? Then the war itself pushed the next door open. By late summer 1943, American farms and factories faced a labor shortage. Millions of American men were in uniform. Production was expanding, not shrinking. Crops still had to be harvested, timber still cut, canneries still run, rail yards still serviced. The solution was practical and legal. Prisoners could be used as labor in non-combat industries. They could not manufacture weapons directly, but they could do the work that freed Americans to build those weapons. So the gates opened, not the fences. The gates, prisoners were loaded onto trucks and buses in broad daylight and driven through towns, down highways, past storefronts and schoolyards, toward cotton fields, sugar beet farms, lumber mills, food processing plants. They traveled without blindfolds. They passed ordinary Americans at gas stations and road intersections. They saw advertisements, billboards, radios playing in open windows, and most unsettling of all, they saw that nobody seemed afraid. In Nazi ideology, the outside world was either chaotic or enslaved. Yet here, people moved with casual confidence, as if the war was something happening far away, not a force that had hollowed out daily life. The stores were full, the diners were open, civilian cars still rolled down the road with families inside. The nation was mobilized, yes, but it was not starving. On farms, German prisoners encountered mechanization that made old European agriculture feel like a different century. Combines cut through fields like ships through water, swallowing wheat in a continuous flow. Tractors did the work of dozens of men. Irrigation systems pushed water across acres with the turn of a valve. Farmers spoke of yields and acreage in numbers that sounded impossible to men raised on cramped land and careful rationing. The shock was not simply that America had machines, Germany had machines too. The shock was the distribution of those machines. They were not reserved for party officials or special projects. They belonged to ordinary farmers. Teenagers drove them. A boy barely old enough to shave could operate equipment worth more than a German family's entire lifetime of savings, and he treated it as normal. For prisoners who came from industrial backgrounds, they watched conveyor belts move without pause. They saw automatic filling machines, electric motors powering systems that reduced labor needs to a fraction of what German plants required. They saw one worker monitoring controls that would have demanded an entire crew back home. Some noticed the worker's posture. Tired, yes, but not desperate. Complaints were about overtime, not starvation. The argument was not about survival, but about schedules. That contrast did something the Americans did not need to plan. It made German prisoners compare their own system to what was in front of them, and the comparison was brutal. Inside the camps, American intelligence officers observed the shift with careful interest. They did not announce a re-education program to the prisoners. They simply watched how quickly the most rigid beliefs softened when confronted by a functioning society. Requests for newspapers increased. Requests for English lessons increased. Men who once refused to speak to guards began asking about wages, housing, universities, and politics. The prisoners' own camp newspapers, produced under supervision, slowly changed tone. Where early editions had leaned on defiance and identity, later issues explored practical questions. How did American elections work? Why were there multiple newspapers with different opinions? How could factories produce at this scale without forced labor? The most fanatical believers did not vanish. Some doubled down, trying to police the compound from within. They intimidated men who seemed too curious, too friendly, too impressed. In some camps, internal violence erupted as hardliners punished those they viewed as traitors, but even this had limits. The hardliners could control conversations in a barracks. They could not control what prisoners had seen through train windows for 3 days, what they saw on work details every morning, what they smelled from meatpacking plants, what they held in their hands when given a newspaper printed with ink, paper, and freedom to criticize its own leaders. And then the Italians changed the atmosphere. When Italy's government broke with Germany and aligned itself against the Axis leadership, Italian prisoners in America were offered a choice: cooperate and live with more privileges, or refuse and remain under stricter rules. Many cooperated. They formed service units, worked more freely, earned better pay, and in some regions interacted more openly with civilians. German prisoners watched this with a kind of stunned resentment. The Italians, whom they had mocked as weak allies, now moved around with lighter restrictions. Some ate in town under supervision, some formed friendships. A few even began relationships with American women through permitted correspondence and supervised contact. To Germans trained to believe in iron loyalty and rigid hierarchy, the scene was not just irritating, it was destabilizing. The Americans did not treat cooperation as betrayal, deserving hatred. They treated it as a practical step toward building something after the war. That word, after, began to hang in the air. Christmas 1943 sharpened the transformation into something emotionally unavoidable. Across the country, American churches, civic groups, and charities sent packages to prisoners, not to their own soldiers, not to their own poor, but to enemy troops who had recently fought and killed Americans. Boxes arrived filled with candy, toiletries, cigarettes, small games, handwritten cards. Choirs performed. Some towns collected baked goods. Camp commanders allowed decorations, concerts, even special meals. For many prisoners, it was the first time in years they had experienced kindness without a demand attached. They had been taught that enemies would be brutal, or at best calculating, yet the gestures felt personal, not official. A handwritten card from a child did not look like propaganda. A box of cookies made by a local church group did not fit the world of racial hatred and total war. Some prisoners reacted with suspicion, others reacted with shame. A few reacted with tears. They tried to hide, and the meal itself did not help them hold the line. Turkey, ham, potatoes, pies, food in quantities they could not reconcile with their own memories of rationing. They ate until they were sick, not because they were greedy, but because they could not accept the idea that such abundance could exist, even for prisoners, unless it was a rare exception. The guards insisted it was not, it was simply what Americans ate. If the enemy could feed captives like this, what did their soldiers receive? What did their factories produce? What did their supply chains look like? By early 1944, education programs expanded. English classes filled barracks. Lectures were organized. Correspondence courses arrived. Libraries grew. Prisoners read American history and found something that propaganda had never mentioned: a country that argued with itself openly and survived, a country that admitted flaws without collapsing, a country that criticized leaders without disappearing into prisons. The effect was slow, but it was relentless. A man could dismiss a speech. He could not dismiss a newspaper printed every day. He could not dismiss a nation that could fight a global war while still leaving store windows lit. and farmhouses electrified, he could not dismiss the fact that he, an enemy soldier, was being treated like a human being in a system that still outworked and outproduced his own. The war outside continued to roar forward, but inside the wire, another war was taking place. Quieter and in some ways more decisive. It was the war between ideology and evidence was winning. By the spring of 1944, the transformation inside the camps was no longer subtle, it was measurable. American intelligence officers who monitored prisoner morale began reporting what they described as an ideological fatigue. Arguments about inevitable German victory faded. Loud political discussions fell quiet. Men who once repeated slogans now listened instead of speaking. When production statistics were mentioned, there was no longer outrage or denial. There was silence. The prisoners had seen too much. Those assigned to industrial work details encountered the final pieces of a puzzle they could no longer ignore. At steel mills, blast furnaces ran day and night without interruption. Ore trains arrived on precise schedules, unloaded, departed, and were replaced by the next. Coal followed the same rhythm. The scale dwarfed anything in Europe. A single American plant could pour more steel in a day than entire German regions managed at peak output, and it did so with workers who complained not about hunger or exhaustion, but about overtime pay. In the Midwest, agricultural labor reached levels that felt almost surreal to men from a continent shaped by scarcity. Prisoners watched as single farms harvested yields larger than entire German provinces. Grain elevators swallowed harvests, measured not in tons, but in futures contracts. The Americans did not speak of survival. They spoke of prices, storage, transportation, and export. Food was not a precious resource to be hoarded. It was a system to be managed. For some prisoners, the most disturbing discovery was not abundance itself, but waste, perfectly usable food discarded because it did not meet cosmetic standards. Crops plowed under to stabilize markets. Entire shipments rejected for minor flaws. Men who had watched their families survive on ration cards struggled to reconcile this with anything they understood. Waste on this scale could only exist in a society so productive it could afford inefficiency without fear. As the Normandy invasion approached, the prisoners sensed something even before official news reached them. Production surged. Trains ran heavier. Factories expanded. Shifts, ports grew louder. The nation did not brace itself for a gamble. It prepared for an operation that assumed success. When news of the landings arrived in June 1944, it was not the fact of invasion that crushed belief, it was the scale. Thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, artificial harbors assembled at sea, supply lines that delivered tens of thousands of tons per day onto open beaches. The prisoners watched newsreels in camp theaters, studying the images with professional eyes. Many had fought on beaches. Many had planned defensive operations. They understood logistics, and they understood immediately that this was not a desperate thrust. It was the expression of overwhelming capacity. From that moment, the idea of German victory ceased to exist in any serious form. The final ideological collapse came not from military defeat, but from moral exposure. As American forces advanced into Germany and liberated concentration camps, the evidence reached the prisoners. At first, many refused to believe it. They claimed the images were staged, that no civilized nation would commit such crimes, that even the Nazi leadership would not go that far. Then letters arrived. Then confirmations followed. Then denial gave way to horror. Men who had clung to some sense of honor now faced the reality that the system they had served was not merely defeated, but criminal. The distinction the Americans had drawn all along between the German people and the Nazi regime suddenly made devastating sense. The Americans had not needed to scream this distinction, they had lived it. Medical care continued, education expanded, psychological counseling was offered to men who broke under the weight of what they had learned. In the Wehrmacht, mental collapse had been punished. Here, it was treated. Prisoners who attempted suicide were not beaten or isolated. They were watched, spoken to, stabilized. To men trained to equate compassion with weakness, this response revealed a different kind of strength. By early 1945, discussion groups inside the camps no longer focused on how Germany might win, but on how Germany might rebuild. Prisoners debated constitutions, land reform, labor rights, and education. Officers who had sworn personal loyalty to Hitler now sketched plans for agricultural modernization and industrial decentralization. Farmers talked about cooperatives, engineers talked about standardization and efficiency, teachers talked about literacy and access. Some prisoners shocked their American supervisors with how quickly they embraced these ideas, not because they were coerced, but because they had seen them work. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, captivity did not end immediately. Repatriation was slow and deliberate. American authorities used the remaining months to prepare prisoners for return to a shattered homeland. Vocational training expanded. Political instruction intensified. Discussions about international cooperation, future aid, and reconstruction became common. Long before the Marshall Plan was announced publicly, its logic was already understood inside the camps. When the first large groups of prisoners boarded ships home, they were not the same men who had arrived 2 years earlier. They returned to cities in ruins, to families struggling to survive, to a nation morally and physically broken. But they carried with them something rare in post-war Europe: certainty that recovery was possible. They had seen it. They had lived inside a society that produced more than it consumed, that rebuilt faster than it destroyed, that treated enemies with dignity, not because it was weak, but because it was confident. They knew that democracy was not chaos. It was organization without terror. They knew that freedom did not reduce efficiency. It amplified it. In the years that followed, former prisoners quietly shaped the rebuilding of West Germany. Others reformed agriculture. Many transformed industry using methods they had first observed as captives. They taught their children what they had learned, not from textbooks, but from experience. Decades later, when former prisoners returned to the United States for reunions, they did not speak of guards or fences. They spoke of farms, factories, libraries, and kitchens. They spoke of electricity, running water, and full plates. They spoke of a moment when everything they believed collapsed and something better took its place. They had arrived in America as enemies, convinced of their own superiority. They left as witnesses. Witnesses to a truth that no propaganda could erase. That the most powerful weapon America possessed was not its bombs, its tanks, or its armies. It was the visible, undeniable proof of what a free society could build, and once seen, it could never be unseen.